November 1944, Camp Hearne, Texas. A column of German prisoners shuffles toward the mess hall, their boots scraping against the dust of a land 9,000 kilometers from home. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 23 years old, captured 3 months earlier in France, braces himself for the usual fare, watery soup, perhaps some bread. He survived worse. The Wehrmacht taught him to expect nothing. But today, something is different. The smell reaches him first. Roasting meat, rich, overwhelming, impossible. His stomach clenches. For a moment, he's back in his mother's kitchen in Hamburg before the war, before the ration cards, before the Allied bombing turned his street into rubble. Then reality crashes back. This is a prison camp in enemy territory. The Americans must be roasting something for themselves, letting the scent torture their captives. He's wrong. The doors swing open and Klaus Hartmann's worldview, carefully constructed by years of Nazi propaganda, reinforced by Goebbels' promises that America was starving, that the Reich would triumph, begins to crumble. On the tables before him, roast turkey, cranberry sauce glistening like jewels, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, sweet potatoes candied to perfection, fresh bread still steaming, pumpkin pie crowned with whipped cream. A feast for prisoners. His hands start to shake. Around him, men stop walking. Someone whispers, "Es ist Gift," it's poison. Another drops to his knees. A third, a hardened panzer commander who'd fought from Kursk to Normandy, puts his face in his hands and weeps. This is the moment everything changes. This is the moment the Third Reich dies in the hearts of men who'd pledged to die for it. Not on a battlefield, not in a moment of military defeat, but in a Texas mess hall confronted by a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage. They'd been lied to about everything. This is the story of how a turkey dinner became a weapon more powerful than bombs. The prisoners arriving at Camp Hearne in the autumn of 1944 carried more than their meager possessions. They carried an entire architecture of belief meticulously constructed over years by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every newsreel had hammered home the same messages. America was weak, decadent, racially impure, and, crucially, starving. The U-boats are strangling them, the propaganda had proclaimed throughout 1943 and 1944. American children cry for bread while Roosevelt sends their fathers to die for Jewish interests. The home front is collapsing. Soon, they will beg for peace. Klaus Hartmann had believed it. Why wouldn't he? At 19, he'd joined the Wehrmacht with pride, convinced of Germany's righteous cause. His father, a veteran of the First War, had warned him to think critically, but those warnings had seemed like the pessimism of an old man who didn't understand the new Germany, the strong Germany, the Germany that would rule for 1,000 years. The crossing to America had been his first shock. The Liberty ship that transported POWs was clean, maintained, adequate. Not luxurious, but not the decrepit vessel he'd expected from a supposedly failing nation. Still, he'd rationalized it. America was big, yes, but spread thin, fighting on 2 fronts, surely near collapse. Then came the train journey across the American heartland, sealed cattle cars, yes, but through the slats, a landscape that made no sense, fields stretching to infinity, heavy with unharvested corn. Towns lit up at night, lit up when Germany had been under blackout for years. Factories with smokestacks pumping steadily. Cars, so many cars, on roads that weren't cratered by bombs. "It's a trick," the older prisoners muttered. "They're showing us a special route. The real America is starving, you'll see." But doubt had begun its corrosive work. Camp Hearne itself had been another contradiction. Built in 1942, the camp sprawled across 690 acres of Texas grassland, housing up to 4,800 German POWs at its peak. The barracks were new, wooden, solid. Not comfortable, this was still prison, but weatherproof, clean, organized. Each prisoner received a bunk with 2 blankets, a locker, basic amenities. The commandant, Colonel A.T. Seymour, ran the camp by the book, the Geneva Convention book, which the guards actually seemed to have read. The daily routine had established itself quickly. Roll call at 600. Breakfast, usually oatmeal, occasionally eggs, always coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd drunk in the Wehrmacht. Work details during the day, either within the camp or, for those who volunteered, on nearby farms desperate for labor as American men shipped overseas. Lunch, more work, dinner, evening recreation, lights out at 2200. It was monotonous. It was imprisonment. But it wasn't harsh. And that, perversely, had been almost harder to bear than brutality would have been. If the Americans had beaten them, starved them, worked them to death, it would have confirmed everything they'd been taught. The enemy would have been recognizably evil. The propaganda would have been vindicated. The war would have made sense. Instead, they were treated with bureaucratic indifference bordering on decency. The guards were neither cruel nor kind, just professional. The camp doctor, an American captain named Henderson, treated injuries without discrimination. The Protestant chaplain held services for those who wanted them. A small library contained books in German, not propaganda, but Goethe, Schiller, even some American novels translated before the war. "They're softening us up," Lieutenant Fischer insisted. A committed Nazi, he organized evening discussions in the barracks, reinforcing party doctrine, reminding everyone that Germany would win, that this captivity was temporary, that the Führer had secret weapons that would turn the tide. "Propaganda reversed," Fischer would say. "They show us a few comforts so we forget who we are. But we remain German soldiers. We remain faithful." And most believed him, or tried to, because the alternative, that everything they'd fought for was a lie, was too terrible to contemplate. The word Thanksgiving began circulating among the prisoners in mid-November. The Americans, it seemed, had a harvest festival, a strange holiday involving turkey and something called gratitude. The German prisoners found this amusing, even pathetic. A holiday for eating? How American, how soft, how perfectly in keeping with their image of a decadent society that valued comfort over honor. "While we were fighting at Stalingrad, they were eating turkey," someone joked bitterly. "While our families are starving on rations, they have a holiday dedicated to overeating," another added. The bitter humor masked deeper anxieties. Letters from home, those that made it through the Red Cross, painted an increasingly grim picture. Klaus had received only 3 letters from his mother since his capture. The first, dated May, had been carefully cheerful. She was well. His sister was working at the hospital. Everyone sent their love. She prayed daily for his safety and Germany's victory. The second letter from July had been shorter, the handwriting shakier. Food was scarce. The ration coupons didn't go far. They'd eaten dandelion greens for dinner twice that week. But she was managing, she insisted. "Don't worry about us. Stay strong." The third letter, dated September, hadn't arrived until late October. It was a single paragraph. Hamburg had been bombed again. Their street was gone. She was alive, staying with Tante Gerda in the countryside. No mention of his sister. No mention of food at all. Just, "I think of you always. May God watch over you." Klaus had read that letter 50 times, holding it until the paper softened and threatened to tear. He kept it folded in his shirt pocket next to his heart, a talisman and a torment. He wasn't alone. Every man in Camp Hearne carried similar weights. Wives who'd gone silent, parents in bombed cities, children evacuated to God knew where. The Reich was shrinking, everyone knew it, even if Lieutenant Fischer insisted otherwise. The Eastern Front had collapsed. France was liberated. The Allies were at Germany's borders. And here they sat, in Texas, eating better than they had in the Wehrmacht. That paradox gnawed at them. The meals at Camp Hearne were plain but adequate. Breakfast, oatmeal or grits with milk, occasionally scrambled eggs, bread with margarine, coffee. Lunch, soup, vegetable, bean, occasionally with meat, bread, sometimes fruit. Dinner, a protein, often canned beef or ham, potatoes or rice, a vegetable, bread, coffee or milk. Nothing fancy, but regular, sufficient. More calories than they'd received in the Wehrmacht trenches. where meals had been irregular, often cold, frequently consisting of hard bread and thin soup supplemented by whatever could be scavenged. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. They were prisoners, defeated, yet eating better than they had as soldiers. Their families were starving in the fatherland, yet here they had enough. The enemy was supposed to be on the brink of collapse, yet showed no signs of deprivation. "It can't last," Fisher kept saying. "This is temporary. They're emptying their reserves to impress us. Soon the reality will show." But it didn't. Week after week the meals continued. The camp routine held steady. More prisoners arrived from Europe, bringing news of further German defeats, yet the American supply lines never faltered. Then came the announcement. On November 20th, the camp commandant issued a notice. On Thursday, November 23rd, in observance of the American Thanksgiving holiday, prisoners would receive a special meal. Details were not specified, but the notice requested that prisoners plan to attend dinner at 1700 hours. The speculation began immediately. A special meal? What did that mean? Extra bread? Real butter instead of margarine? Maybe canned chicken instead of beef? "It's propaganda," Fisher declared at evening assembly. "They'll give us something slightly better and expect us to grovel in gratitude. Don't fall for it. Accept the food. We're not fools. But remember, it changes nothing. We are German soldiers. We don't break for Turkey." Klaus listened but said nothing. He'd stopped arguing with Fisher weeks ago. What was the point? Either Germany would win, which seemed increasingly unlikely, or it would lose, and everything they'd believed would prove to be ash. Arguing wouldn't change the outcome. November 23, 1944, 16:45 hours. The November sun hung low over Camp Hearne, casting long shadows across the compound. The temperature had dropped to near freezing overnight, unusual for Texas, and the prisoners had been grateful for their barracks' wood stoves. Klaus had spent the day on a work detail, repairing a section of fence damaged by a recent windstorm. Physical labor was welcome. It kept the mind from dwelling on what couldn't be changed. But as 1700 hours approached, he'd noticed a strange tension among the American guards. They weren't hostile, but there was an alertness, an expectancy, as if they anticipated something significant. The prisoners gathered in the compound, forming loose columns by barracks. Nearly 4,000 men, most in their 20s and 30s, wearing an odd mixture of their original Wehrmacht uniforms, minus insignia, American-issued work clothes, and improvised combinations. Some had fashioned crude caps from available materials. Others wore thin coats against the chill. All were hungry, not starving, but the day's work had built a solid appetite. The doors to Mess Hall No. 2 stood closed. This was unusual. Typically they opened early, allowing prisoners to filter in gradually. Today the guards waited, checking watches, conferring in low voices. At exactly 1700, Captain Morrison, the mess officer, stepped forward. A career Army man from Pennsylvania, Morrison had a reputation for running his operation with precision. He nodded to the guards, who swung open the double doors. The smell hit like a physical force. Klaus froze. His mind, trained by years of scarcity to catalog every food scent, couldn't process what it was detecting. Roasting meat, yes, but rich, almost sweet. Herbs. Sage, he thought, though he hadn't smelled that since before the war. Baking bread, yeast, and warmth. Something else. Spices he couldn't name. Cinnamon, perhaps. Mixed with butter and sugar. Impossible. The first men through the doors stopped so abruptly that those behind collided into them. A ripple of confusion spread through the column. Someone swore. Someone else laughed, a strange, almost hysterical sound. Klaus pushed forward, needing to see. The mess hall had been transformed. The long tables, usually bare metal, were covered with white paper. At each place setting, a real plate, not a mess tin, a knife, fork, and spoon, a napkin, and on the serving line. Klaus's vision tunneled. His ears rang. His hands, calloused from work, began to shake. Roast turkey. Dozens of them golden brown, glistening, piled on massive serving platters. Each bird was surrounded by stuffing, by vegetables, by abundance, cranberry sauce in bowls, dark red, gleaming, mashed potatoes in industrial-sized containers, butter pooling in yellow lakes on their surfaces, sweet potatoes candied orange and sticky, green beans, fresh, not canned, almonds scattered on top, bread, rolls actually, soft white rolls, steaming, stacked in pyramids, real butter in individual pats, celery sticks and olives in dishes like something from a restaurant. And at the end of the line, impossible, surely a hallucination, pies, pumpkin pies, dozens of them topped with whipped cream, coffee, fresh coffee, the kind that smelled like home, like peacetime, like a world that no longer existed. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the breakdown began. Es ist eine Falle, someone whispered. It's a trap. Vergiftet? Poisoned? Warum? Why? Klaus stood paralyzed. His rational mind tried to work. This was a mess hall. These were American guards. There was no reason to expect poison. But his belief system, everything he'd been taught about the enemy, about American weakness and deprivation, couldn't reconcile what his eyes were seeing. Behind him, Gefreiter Hans Müller, a farm boy from Bavaria who'd been conscripted at 17, dropped to his knees. Not in supplication, in shock. His body simply stopped functioning, overwhelmed by contradiction. Meine Mutter, Hans whispered. Meine Mutter hat kein Brot. My mother has no bread. That was when Klaus understood. This wasn't about the food, not really. This was about the totality of the lie. Every newsreel showing Americans starving, every broadcast claiming enemy collapse, every promise that Germany was winning, that sacrifice was necessary, that their cause was just. All of it shattered by the simple fact of a turkey dinner. Lieutenant Fischer pushed through the crowd, his face rigid. Pull yourselves together, he snapped. It's a psychological operation. They're trying to break our morale. Don't give them the satisfaction. But his voice cracked on the last word. And Klaus saw what Fischer was staring at, an American sergeant casually eating a roll while overseeing the serving line, as if this abundance was unremarkable, as if this was normal. That was the devastating part. To the Americans, this was normal. The serving began mechanically. Prisoners shuffled forward, plates extended, as American mess staff, both soldiers and a few civilian employees, loaded each plate with portions that would have fed a Wehrmacht squad for a day. A drumstick and 3 slices of breast meat, a scoop of stuffing that spilled over the plate's edge, mashed potatoes, 2 servings, sweet potatoes, beans, cranberry sauce, a roll, sometimes 2. Butter, real butter, not the margarine they'd grown accustomed to. Take your time, one of the servers said in rough German. Plenty more if you want seconds. Seconds. The word hung in the air like smoke. Klaus sat at a table with his usual group, Hans the farm boy, Otto the mechanic from Stuttgart, Werner the schoolteacher turned infantry sergeant, and Friedrich, a quiet man from Dresden who rarely spoke since learning his entire family had died in the February bombing. 5 men, staring at food like it might disappear. Otto picked up his fork, examined it, set it down. I don't understand. It's Thanksgiving, Werner said flatly. They explained it in orientation, American holiday. They eat like this every year. Every year? Hans's voice was hoarse. While Germany, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They all understood the calculus. While German children received 200 grams of bread per day, Americans feasted. While German soldiers ate frozen potatoes and horse meat on the Eastern Front, Americans had turkey. While Hamburg and Dresden burned, Texas held harvest festivals. It doesn't mean anything, Otto insisted, but his eyes were wet. They're a big country, lots of land. Doesn't mean they're stronger, doesn't mean... Eat, Friedrich said, his first words in days. Your mother would want you to eat. So they ate. Klaus cut into the turkey. The meat was moist, tender, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. He chewed slowly, tasting not just the food, but the implications. This bird had been raised, fed, slaughtered, cooked, all requiring resources, supply chains, fuel, labor. Multiply by the dozens of turkeys in this mess hall. Multiply by the hundreds of POW camps across America. Multiply by the American military worldwide. Multiply by the civilian population at home. The mathematics of abundance were crushing. He tried the stuffing. Bread, yes, but mixed with celery, onions, sage, butter. Someone had time to make this. Someone had ingredients to spare. In Germany, bread was precious, rationed, fought over. Here it was casually baked, torn into pieces, and stuffed into a bird. The mashed potatoes were smooth, creamy, rich with butter and milk. Real milk, not powdered. Real butter, not ersatz. Around the mess hall, reactions varied. Some men ate ravenously as if trying to consume the evidence of their error. Others picked at their food, nauseated by plenty. A group in the corner sat stone-faced, refusing to eat, loyalty to the Führer requiring the rejection of enemy generosity. But most ate and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears running down faces bent over plates, men chewing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the cruelty of understanding. Because this meal was cruel in its way. Not the food itself, but what it represented. The vast gulf between what they'd believed and what was real. They're not starving, Hans said, wonder and horror in his voice. They were never starving. We were lied to about everything. We don't know that, Otto tried. Maybe just this camp, maybe just Texas, maybe... Stop. Werner's voice cut through. The schoolteacher had found his clarity. Look around. The guards. They're not surprised by this. It's normal for them. This isn't special by their standards. This is just Thursday. Silence at the table. Then Friedrich. My wife's last letter. February before the bombing. She wrote that they'd eaten potato peels for dinner. Peels. Boiled with salt. His hands trembled on his fork. I'm eating turkey. The guilt settled over them like fallout. They were prisoners, yes, but comfortable prisoners. Fed prisoners. Safe prisoners. While their families, the people they'd sworn to protect by serving the Reich, starved and burned. Klaus thought of his mother in Tante Gerda's countryside cottage, if it still stood, eating whatever rural charity could provide. He thought of his sister, whose absence from recent letters suggested a fate he didn't want to imagine. He thought of millions of German civilians loyal to the Führer, enduring privation because they believed sacrifice would bring victory. And he thought of himself, here, eating pumpkin pie with whipped cream while Hamburg smoldered. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. So minds did what minds do when faced with unbearable truth. They broke, or adapted, or reconstituted themselves into new shapes. Captain Morrison had been truthful. There was enough for seconds. Klaus watched as American servers brought out more turkeys, more potatoes, more rolls. The abundance seemed infinite, obscene, miraculous. Some prisoners went back for more food, hunger overcoming ideology. Others sat paralyzed. A few, Fischer's loyalists, stood and left, refusing to participate in what they saw as a betrayal of German suffering. Traitors, one of them spat as he passed Klaus's table. Eating the enemy's food while our people starve. You disgust me. Klaus didn't respond. He was beyond responding. He was in the space between worlds, the world he'd believed in, and the world that actually existed. The gulf between them was so vast he felt vertigo. Hans went for seconds, came back with more turkey, more of everything, ate mechanically, tears still streaming. I'm sorry, he kept saying between bites. I'm sorry, Mutter. I'm sorry. Sorry for eating. Sorry for being captured. Sorry for surviving. Sorry for believing the lie. The apology encompassed everything and nothing. Otto pushed his plate away, half-eaten. I can't. It's too much. I feel sick. Eat it. Werner's voice was hard. Men are starving everywhere. Wasting food is a sin. Living is a sin. Otto's response was bitter. We should have died honorably. Instead, we're here prisoners. eating better than we did as soldiers, while the Reich collapses. The Reich. Friedrich laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The 1,000-year Reich. Did we ever ask what that meant? Really ask? 1,000 years of what? This? He gestured at the mess hall. We were building a 1,000-year Reich that couldn't feed its people for 5 years. Careful. Werner glanced around. Even in captivity, old habits died hard. Defeatist talk, criticism of the regime, these were dangerous, even here. Perhaps especially here, among men whose entire identities were built on loyalty to a cause now revealed as hollow. But Friedrich didn't stop. Something had broken in him, or been freed. We were told Jews were parasites, draining Germany's resources. But look at this. He pointed at his plate. America has Jews, many Jews, and they have this. More food than we ever had, even before the war. So either the propaganda was wrong about Jews, or wrong about economics, or wrong about everything. The silence at the table was profound. Klaus knew what Friedrich was doing, speaking the unspeakable, taking the thread of doubt that the Thanksgiving meal had pulled loose and following it to its logical end. If the propaganda had lied about American starvation, what else was a lie? If the Jews weren't the cause of German suffering, what was? If the Reich's ideology was false, what had they been fighting for? Don't. Werner's voice was a warning. Don't go there. Not here. Not now. Why not? Friedrich's eyes were wild. My family is dead. My city is rubble. I'm eating turkey in Texas. When exactly is the right time to acknowledge that we fought for nothing, that we killed for nothing? Enough! Werner stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. Other prisoners turned to look. American guards shifted, alert to potential conflict. Werner's face was red, furious, but underneath, Klaus saw terror. Terror of the same questions Friedrich was voicing. Werner sat back down slowly, deliberately. When he spoke, his voice was controlled. We were soldiers, following orders, serving our country. That's all we were. We don't have to answer for anything else. Don't we? Friedrich asked quietly. No one answered, because the truth was, they didn't know. The Nuremberg tribunals were still months away. The full scope of Nazi atrocities wouldn't be revealed to the German public until after the war. These men, most of them ordinary soldiers, genuinely didn't yet know the full extent of what had been done in their name. But they were beginning to suspect. And this meal, this simple American holiday meal, was showing them that everything they'd been told to justify the war was false. If the lies about America were so obvious, what other lies remained to be uncovered? The pumpkin pie arrived at their table courtesy of a middle-aged American mess worker, a civilian with kind eyes who placed a slice before each of them with careful attention. "Happy Thanksgiving, boys," he said in English. Then, in halting German, "Gutes Essen, good food." He walked away before they could respond. Klaus stared at the pie. He'd never had pumpkin pie, had never even heard of it before America. The orange filling was smooth, set firm, topped with a generous dollop of whipped cream. The crust looked buttery, flaky. He took a bite, sweet but not cloying, spiced with cinnamon and something else, rich and creamy on his tongue. It was delicious. It was devastating. "This is a dessert," Otto said wonderingly. "After all that food, they give us dessert." Hans had stopped crying. His face was blank now, shock giving way to a kind of numb acceptance. "This is how they eat," he said. "This is normal for them. They can fight a war on 2 fronts, keep their people fed, and still have dessert." "No wonder we lost," Werner muttered. "We haven't lost yet," someone at the next table objected, a true believer, still clinging to hope. "The Führer has secret weapons. The V2 rockets are just the beginning. There are others, superweapons, that will—" "There are no superweapons," Werner interrupted. "There's just this." He held up a forkful of pie. "Industrial capacity, resources, food, they have it. We don't. That's the war. Everything else is theater." Klaus found himself nodding. The schoolteacher was right. War wasn't about courage or ideology or racial purity. It was about steel production, oil reserves, agricultural output, factory capacity. And this meal demonstrated more clearly than any strategic briefing exactly how outmatched Germany had been from the start. The Americans could afford to feed prisoners, enemy combatants, men who'd killed American soldiers, better than Germany could feed its own troops. That single fact contained the entire arc of the war. Around the mess hall, the mood was shifting. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a strange, muted atmosphere. Some prisoners ate their pie in silence. Others talked in low voices, processing, recalibrating. The true believers had mostly left, unwilling to participate in what they saw as a betrayal. But the majority remained, not out of ideological surrender, but simple acknowledgement of reality. Coffee was poured, real coffee, hot and strong. Klaus wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling its warmth. In the Wehrmacht, coffee had been a precious luxury. Here it flowed freely, refills offered without limit. "What happens now?" Hans asked. The question hung in the air, larger than itself. "We finish the war in prison," Otto said. "Wait for Germany to surrender. Then, who knows? Will they hang us? Send us home? Keep us?" "Home." Friedrich tasted the word. "What home? My city is gone. My family is gone. What do I go back to?" It was a question without answer. The Germany they'd left, the Germany of parades and promises, of confident swagger and certain victory, no longer existed. Whether physically destroyed or ideologically shattered, it was gone. What would rise from the ruins was anybody's guess. "We'll have to rebuild," Werner said. "Whatever's left. We'll have to acknowledge what happened, what was done, and build something different." "If they let us," Klaus said. "The victors might not be forgiving." "Would we be?" Friedrich asked. "If the situation were reversed? If Germany had won and American POWs were in our camps?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They'd all heard rumors about the camps in the East, about treatment of Soviet prisoners, about things that weren't supposed to be discussed, that good soldiers didn't think about. If America had lost and Americans were imprisoned in Germany, Klaus doubted very much they'd be eating turkey. That realization brought another wave of dissonance. The Americans were treating them not with the brutality of victors, but with the bureaucratic decency of a nation that could afford generosity, because they'd already won. The outcome was certain. This abundance was proof. "I'm going to remember this," Hans said suddenly. "When I go home, if I go home, I'm going to tell people about this, about Thanksgiving in Texas, about how the enemy we were taught to despise fed us better than our own Reich did." "They'll call you a traitor," Otto warned. "Maybe." Hans shrugged. "But it's true. And I'm tired of lies." Klaus understood. They were all tired of lies, exhausted by propaganda, worn down by ideology, hollowed out by cognitive dissonance. The truth, simple, material, undeniable truth represented by this meal was almost a relief, even as it destroyed everything they'd believed in. By 1900 hours, the meal was over. Prisoners filed out of the mess hall back into the cold November evening. The camp routine would resume. Barracks, lights out, another day tomorrow. But something fundamental had shifted. Klaus walked back with his group in silence. The camp compound looked different somehow. Not the physical space, which remained the same chain link and barracks, but the psychological space. It was still a prison, yes. But it was a prison in a country that had just demonstrated its overwhelming superiority, not through weapons, but through abundance. In the barracks, men gathered in clusters, processing. The true believers huddled together, reinforcing each other's denial. "It changes nothing," Lieutenant Fischer insisted. "One meal doesn't win a war. Germany will prevail." But his audience had shrunk. Most prisoners were elsewhere in other conversations, asking other questions. Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The meal sat heavy in his stomach, not uncomfortably, just unfamiliarly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly full. Even in peacetime, his family had been working class, meals adequate but never abundant. In the Wehrmacht, hunger had been constant. Here, for one night, he'd eaten until satiated, and hated himself for it. The guilt was irrational but powerful. His mother was hungry. Germany was hungry. How dare he be full? Stop thinking about it. Werner's voice came from the next bunk. What's done is done. You ate. You're alive. That's not a crime. Isn't it? Klaus asked. No. Werner was quiet for a moment. Survival isn't a crime. Believing lies wasn't a crime. We were lied to. Fighting for our country, even a country that lied to us, wasn't a crime. We're soldiers. We did our duty. Now we survive until we can go home and face whatever comes. And if there's nothing to go home to, then we build something new. Werner's voice was firm. We don't repeat the mistakes. We don't believe the easy lies. We remember that the enemy fed us when our own leaders let us starve. And we build a Germany that deserves its people. It was a beautiful sentiment. Klaus wanted to believe it, but he'd believed beautiful sentiments before, about racial destiny, national greatness, thousand-year empires. Where did belief lead except to betrayal? I don't know what to believe anymore, Klaus admitted. Good. Werner's response was unexpected. Certainty is what got us here. Maybe doubt will get us out. Across the barracks, Hans was writing a letter by dim lamplight. Klaus knew it would be censored, might never reach Hamburg, might arrive to find no one alive to read it. But Hans wrote anyway, documenting this day, this meal, this moment of transformation. Otto was crying quietly in his bunk, face to the wall. Friedrich sat motionless, staring at nothing. Other men played cards, told jokes, tried to maintain normalcy. The human capacity for adaptation was remarkable. Even after an earthquake of belief, routines reasserted themselves. But nothing would be quite the same. The Thanksgiving meal had achieved what no propaganda, no re-education program, no explicit American pressure could have achieved. It had shown German prisoners in the most material and undeniable way that the world they thought they knew was fiction. The days after Thanksgiving saw subtle changes ripple through Camp Hearne. Attendance at Fischer's evening ideological sessions dropped. Not dramatically, many prisoners still clung to the familiar frameworks, but noticeably. The certainty in the room had developed cracks. Work details took on a different character. Prisoners who'd previously done the minimum now worked more willingly, not out of collaboration with the enemy, but out of a kind of pragmatic acknowledgement. The war was ending. Germany was losing. Burning bridges with the probable victors seemed foolish. Letters home, those that could still reach Germany, changed tone. Earlier letters had been full of reassurances. Don't worry, I'm fine. Germany will win. We'll be reunited soon. Post-Thanksgiving letters were more honest, or at least less propagandistic. Men wrote about the reality of American abundance, about their treatment, about doubts they'd once kept hidden. Of course, most letters never made it through the chaos of a collapsing Reich. But the writing itself mattered. It was a way of processing, of externalizing the internal revolution. Klaus found himself in unexpected conversations with Otto, who'd been a mechanic in civilian life, about how they might rebuild Germany's industry without militarization. With Werner about education that taught critical thinking rather than obedience. With Friedrich, who'd stopped eating for 3 days after Thanksgiving, his guilt too overwhelming, but who finally accepted food when Klaus pointed out that starving himself wouldn't feed his dead family. Survivor's guilt, the camp doctor, Captain Henderson, called it when Friedrich finally came to the infirmary. Common among prisoners who are better off than their loved ones. Nothing to be ashamed of, nothing you can fix by punishing yourself. Henderson's kindness was itself part of the problem. The Americans kept refusing to be monsters. They were just people. Farmers' sons from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shopkeepers from Massachusetts, doing a job with neither exceptional cruelty nor exceptional kindness. Professional, decent, ordinary. And that ordinariness was perhaps most devastating of all. The Third Reich had taught that Americans were decadent weaklings, racial mongrels, incapable of real strength. But the men guarding Camp Hearne were no different from Wehrmacht soldiers, ordinary men following orders, neither heroes nor villains. The grand narrative of racial superiority collapsed in the face of this mundane equality. Christmas came 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. The prisoners expected nothing special. Thanksgiving had been the American holiday after all. But on December 25th, another feast appeared. Not as elaborate as Thanksgiving, but substantial. Roast pork, red cabbage, Stollen, traditional German Christmas bread somehow procured, potatoes, and yes, dessert again. This time there were fewer tears. The shock had worn off. This was simply how it was. America had resources to spare, even for enemies. The lesson had been learned, but the meals still carried emotional weight, especially for men thinking of Christmases past, of families gathered around tables that no longer existed. Hans received a letter that week, a miracle in the chaos of late 1944. His mother was alive in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. His 2 younger sisters were with her. They had survived the bombing of their village. They were hungry, cold, frightened, but alive. He read the letter aloud to the barracks, voice cracking. Then he folded it carefully and said, "When this is over, I'm going to take them to America." "They won't let you," Otto objected. "We're enemy nationals. After the war, Germany will need decades to recover," Hans interrupted. "My mother is 50 years old. My sisters are 14 and 12. They don't have decades. America has food. America has opportunity. America has what Germany will not have for a generation. I'm going to find a way to bring them here." It was a stunning declaration. To prefer the enemy's country over the fatherland was, by any traditional standard, treasonous. But no one in the barracks called it treason, because they all understood. The old standards had died in a Texas mess hall on Thanksgiving Day. "I'll go back," Werner said. "Germany is still my country, flawed and broken as it is. Someone has to rebuild it. Someone has to teach the next generation differently." "I have nowhere to go," Friedrich said simply. "So I'll go wherever they send me and try to be useful." Klaus didn't know what he'd do. Return to Hamburg if it still existed? Try to find his mother and sister if they'd survived? Build a new life in the ruins of the old? All options seemed equally possible and impossible. January 1945 brought news that confirmed what the Thanksgiving meal had demonstrated. Germany was finished. The Soviet offensive in the east was crushing. The Western Allies had recovered from the Ardennes counteroffensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble, and were pushing toward the Rhine. The Reich was being squeezed from all directions, and everyone, even the most committed Nazis, could see the end approaching. In Camp Hearne, the dynamic shifted again. Prisoners who'd hoped for German victory now hoped merely for German survival. Conversations turned from when we win to what happens when we lose. The true believers, Fischer and his circle, became increasingly isolated. Their insistence on ultimate German victory sounded delusional even to sympathetic ears. Some prisoners actively avoided them, not wanting to be associated with the losing side's most fanatical adherents when the accounting came. Klaus watched this social reorganization with anthropological fascination. The same men who'd marched in lockstep 6 months ago were now forming new alliances, new identities, preparing for a post-Nazi future. It was survival instinct, rats fleeing a sinking ship perhaps, but also something more hopeful, the possibility of change, of learning, of becoming something other than what they'd been. February brought Valentine's Day, another American holiday the prisoners didn't understand, but it came with cookies and chocolate distributed by the Red Cross, and that was enough. March brought spring to Texas, wildflowers blooming across the campgrounds, temperatures rising, the world renewing itself while Germany died. And then, April. The news came in fragments through American newspapers that prisoners were now allowed to read, through guards' conversations, through the increasing depression of the camp's most ardent Nazis. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich had surrendered unconditionally. It was over. The reaction in Camp Hearne was complex, layered, contradictory. Relief that the dying could stop. Horror at what Germany's defeat would mean. Grief for lost comrades, lost family, lost years. Vindication for those who'd accepted reality early. Despair for those who'd believed until the end. Uncertainty about what came next for everyone. Klaus felt numb. He'd known this was coming since Thanksgiving, really. The turkey dinner had been prophecy, and now the prophecy was fulfilled. Germany had lost. The Reich was gone. Everything he'd been taught to believe in had proven false. And yet, he was alive. Fed. Whole. He'd survived. That had to mean something. The repatriation process took months. Germany was in chaos, divided into occupation zones, its infrastructure destroyed, its population traumatized. The Allies in no hurry to send POWs back to a country that couldn't feed or house them. Many prisoners remained in American camps through 1945 and into 1946, working on farms and factories, earning small wages, sending money to families in Germany when the banking systems finally allowed it. Klaus stayed in Camp Hearne until September 1945. By then, the camp had changed character entirely. It was no longer a prison in any meaningful sense, more a displaced persons facility, holding men who had nowhere else to go. The guards were relaxed, the fences more symbolic than functional. Prisoners could volunteer for work details that took them into nearby towns, where Texans regarded them with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and eventual indifference. He worked on a cotton farm owned by a man named Jackson, a weathered Texan who spoke no German, and whose English Klaus barely understood. But they communicated through work, through shared meals, never as elaborate as Thanksgiving, but always sufficient, through the universal language of soil and seasons. One evening in August, Jackson invited Klaus to eat dinner with his family, wife, 3 daughters, elderly mother. They said grace before the meal, a practice Klaus had seen in the camp, but which felt different in a home, intimate and sincere. The food was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, nothing fancy. But it was shared family food, and Klaus found himself choking up. Mrs. Jackson noticed. "You all right, son?" "Yes, ma'am." The English words were still clumsy in his mouth. "Thank you. For food. For kindness." She nodded. "You're far from home. We've all got boys far from home. Seems only right to feed one who needs feeding." It was such a simple statement of common humanity that Klaus had to excuse himself, stepping out onto the porch where he cried for the first time since Thanksgiving. Not from grief, exactly, from recognition. The war had tried to make them all less than human, enemies, others, categories rather than individuals. But this Texas farm family had refused that dehumanization, had seen him as simply a young man far from home, and had fed him. That was what America was, he realized. Not the government or the military or the economic system. It was Mrs. Jackson offering chicken to a stranger who'd fought for a regime that would have annihilated her if given the chance. It was abundance shared rather than hoarded. It was the quiet radicalism of decency. When Klaus finally returned to Germany in October 1945, it was to a country he barely recognized. Hamburg was rubble. His mother was alive, miraculously, living in a cousin's basement. His sister had died in 1944, typhus, in a hospital that had no medicine. His father had been killed in an air raid while Klaus was in Texas eating turkey. The guilt returned, fierce and consuming. He'd been safe, fed, alive while his family suffered and died. No rationalization could ease that burden. But his mother, when he finally found her, wouldn't allow his self-flagellation. "You survived," she said, gripping his hands with fingers made skeletal by starvation. "That's what matters. You survived, and now you'll help us rebuild. Tell me, how did they treat you? The Americans?" So he told her about Camp Hearne, about Thanksgiving dinner, about turkey and pumpkin pie and coffee with real cream, about American abundance that made a mockery of Nazi propaganda, about the ordinary decency of enemy soldiers who followed the Geneva Convention and treated prisoners like human beings. She listened, tears streaming down her gaunt face. "Good," she finally said. "I'm glad. I'm glad they fed you. I'm glad one of my children was fed." It was forgiveness he didn't deserve, but accepted anyway, because survival required it. Klaus Hartmann never forgot that Thanksgiving dinner in Camp Hearne, Texas, 1944. In the decades that followed, through Germany's reconstruction, through the economic miracle, through reunification, he carried the memory like a talisman. He became a teacher like Werner had planned, taught history to German children born after the war, children who needed to understand what had happened and why, so it would never happen again. And every November, when American Thanksgiving approached, he would tell his students about the turkey dinner that ended the war in his heart. "We were taught to hate," he would say. Taught that our enemies were inferior, that we were destined to rule, that hardship proved our superiority. And then the enemy fed us better than our own leaders had fed us. And in that moment, every lie collapsed. We saw with undeniable clarity that we'd been fooled, that the real strength wasn't in ideology or racial purity or military swagger. It was in the simple capacity to produce enough, to share abundance, to treat even enemies with basic human decency. That's what defeated the Third Reich, he would tell his students, not just bombs and bullets, though those mattered. But the demonstration that everything we'd been taught was false. The Americans didn't need to break us with cruelty. They broke us with kindness, with turkey and pumpkin pie, with the unbearable weight of realized lies. Some students understood, others didn't, couldn't really. How could anyone who hadn't lived through it understand the totality of that cognitive collapse? But Klaus kept telling the story anyway, because memory was sacred, and truth was precious, and future generations needed to know how easy it was to believe lies and how devastating it was to discover the truth. Hans made it to America eventually in 1951, sponsoring his mother and sisters to join him in 1953. They settled in Iowa, opened a bakery, became Americans. Hans never spoke German again if he could avoid it. The language itself reminded him of the lies. But every Thanksgiving he cooked a massive feast, inviting neighbors, strangers, anyone who needed a meal, trying to pay forward the generosity that had broken his world apart and remade it into something better. Werner rebuilt Germany, as he'd promised, became a school administrator in Munich, reformed curricula, fought against the ex-Nazis who tried to whitewash history. He died in 1983, having never visited America, but he kept a menu from that Thanksgiving dinner framed on his office wall, a reminder of what abundance looked like, what truth cost, what defeat had taught. Friedrich disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. Some said he'd gone to South America. Others thought he'd died in the rubble-clearing work that employed so many homeless men in the late 1940s. Klaus never learned what became of him, but hoped he'd found some peace, some purpose, some way to live with the weight of what had been lost. Otto became a mechanic again in Stuttgart's recovering automotive industry. He never married, never spoke of the war, lived a quiet life of routine and solitude. But he volunteered at a food bank in his later years, serving meals to the homeless, the immigrants, the displaced. When asked why, he'd just say, "Someone fed me once when I didn't deserve it, paying it back." And Lieutenant Fischer? He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, not major ones, but he'd been SS before his Wehrmacht service, had participated in actions in Poland that haunted him to the dock. He was executed in 1947, maintaining his loyalty to the Führer until the end. Some men could face truth and adapt. Others couldn't. Fischer had been one of the latter, a true believer who'd rather die than admit he'd been wrong. His final letter, smuggled out of prison, was found decades later. In it, he'd written, "I still believe we were right, but I remember the turkey dinner, and sometimes, in my cell, I wonder if that was the moment I should have understood, if everything had been explained in that one meal, and I was too blind to see. God forgive me if I was wrong. but I die believing I was right, because to believe otherwise would mean I wasted my life on a lie, and that I cannot accept. The inability to accept, that was the tragedy. Not just of Fischer, but of millions who'd invested so much in the Nazi project that its failure meant their own failure. Some adapted, some couldn't. History ground them all, regardless. 79 years later, in a different world, the story of German POWs weeping over Thanksgiving dinner survives as historical footnote, remembered by few, understood by fewer. But its significance extends beyond the moment, beyond the men who experienced it, beyond even the war itself. It was a lesson in the power of material reality over ideology. You can teach men to hate, indoctrinate them in racial theories, drill into them beliefs about their own superiority and their enemy's degradation. But when those men are confronted with undeniable evidence that their beliefs are false, when they're fed by the enemies they were taught were starving, shown abundance by the nation they were told was collapsing, ideology shatters against reality. It was a lesson in the effectiveness of humane treatment. The Americans didn't feed German POWs elaborate Thanksgiving dinners out of psychological warfare calculation, though it certainly had that effect. They did it because that's what Americans did on Thanksgiving. They ate turkey, and the rules said POWs should receive adequate food, and adequate American food meant turkey on Thanksgiving. The destruction of Nazi ideology was almost a side effect of simple bureaucratic decency. It was a lesson in the relationship between abundance and power. Nazi Germany had built its entire system on the myth of scarcity, that resources were limited, that survival required conquest, that only the strong deserved to eat. America disproved all of it by having so much that even prisoners ate well. The turkey dinner was a demonstration of industrial and agricultural capacity that made military victory almost secondary. The war was won in Iowa cornfields and Kansas wheat fields and Texas cattle ranches as much as on European battlefields. And it was a lesson in memory and trauma. For men like Klaus Hartmann, that Thanksgiving dinner became a reference point, a before and after moment, the instant when one worldview died and another had to be constructed from its ruins. The psychological impact of realized lies is profound and lasting. Those prisoners carried that moment for the rest of their lives, some as liberation, some as guilt, some as education, but all as transformation. In the end, the story is simple. Men were fed, men wept, men changed. But simplicity shouldn't be confused with insignificance. Sometimes the most profound revolutions happen not on battlefields or in palaces, but in mess halls, over dinner, when what we believe crashes against what is real, and we're forced to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. The German POWs in Texas chose truth, or rather, truth chose them, served on a platter with cranberry sauce. And nothing was ever the same again.